Welcome to Big Blend Radio's Nature Connection show with Lisa and Nancy, publishers of Big Blend magazines, and nature photographer Margot Carrera. Welcome, everybody. We're excited today to welcome ecologist Carl Safina to join us on the show to talk about his new book, Alfie Me, What Owls Know, What Humans Believe. I love this. This book is so it's sentimental. It's good feelings. It's also going to make us look a little bit deeper in our backyard. So I encourage you to go to his website, carlsafina.org, and that's Carl with a C. So welcome, Carl. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks. Thanks so much for having me.
It's good to have you on the show. Welcome back, Margot. How are you doing over in San Diego?
Oh, I am doing great. I'm loving the fall.
Ah, I love that. Carl, I love your book. I'm knee deep in it, and like there's so much meaning, and you even get into like the indigenous cultures. You bring people and animals and birds, obviously Alfie the screech owl, together, and you talk about your property being what, only 3/4 of an acre? Am I right? It's
I think
it's
it's actually a little smaller than that. I think it's about 2/3 of an acre. And we have a woodland on the north and the east side, sort of wraps half of our backyard. So, and that's about 30 acres. But we're in the suburbs pretty much. And across the street, there's a little stream that runs into a couple of mill ponds that runs into the bay that's about half a mile away. So we're sort of on the edge of the suburbs here.
Wow. And so this kind of is a lesson for all of us to kind of look in our backyards a little bit to realize what's happening and that we can have these relationships with animals. But obviously, you being an ecologist, and I know that you have every, all the degrees and permits to, look after a sick little, baby screech owl and bring the screech owl home and care for them. Not all of us have that ability, right? And maybe shouldn't do that. So I kind of want to start with that about what happens when we find a baby bird. What should we do?
Well, in a lot of places, there are wildlife rehabilitators and wildlife rehabilitation centers. So a good thing is to know where they are and just have that number somewhere, so that when you find something, you know who to call instead of saying, "Oh, I just found this bird and it's dying. Who should I call?" It's good to know who to call. It saves a lot of time, especially when you're a little, upset about something that you've just found.
Mm. And it seems like you do a lot of rehabilitation in your mudroom, raccoons,
We
birds.
we've done a bit. I did a lot more when I was young, and I helped to found a wildlife rehabilitation group that is still going on Long Island, where I live here on the East Coast. Um, Nowadays, it's just a couple of things that we have found over the last few years that we have raised. Alfie being really in a way the most amazing experience.
Mm. And that's you have observation, but isn't it kind of interesting where you can help nurture young to adulthood, right? And then you have that connection, and then they kind of break free and remind you that, hey, no matter what, we're still wild, even with dogs. And I know you have chickens too, things like that. There's always that little element that reminds us that I've always got this little wild streak in us, even no matter how connected we get.
Well, that's true. Maybe it's even true for people, and maybe sometimes, unfortunately, so. But yeah, sometimes I look at our chickens, which they're always loose in the yard during the daytime, and then in the evening they go back into the coop to go to sleep, and we just shut the door, let them out in the morning. And they're constantly foraging. They get a lot of their own food on their own. They are very good at catching bugs. They sometimes prefer, if I leave part of a large part of our lawn unmowed, the seed heads on the grass are what they prefer to the seed we feed them. And so there's a lot of instinctual behavior still left in these chickens, despite the tremendous amount of domesticated selective breeding that's gone into them. So yeah, with Alfie the owl, it was she's not domesticated at all. And yet, because she was raised from a little chick who was near death, she's tame. Some people would have said that she's imprinted and that she thinks she's a person and she doesn't know she's an owl. But she has had 2 different wild mates over the last 5 years. She has raised 10 youngsters on her own. All of her owl instincts and skills are all working, despite the fact that she recognizes us and she's still tame around us. We see her almost every night, and it's a magical kind of a thing. And it's just been a fantastic opportunity to watch wild owls doing their thing at point blank range, because the mother is completely part of our family and part of our life here, and she just doesn't have any concerns about us being right there, or even right next to her, or right next to her young ones, even though she's been free living for 5 years.
Mm. It's amazing. We were at Tiffany's Bed and Breakfast in Arkansas, just outside Hot Springs National Park, and they have like over 60 acres of woodlands, and we're sitting on the patio, like the front. They have a big wraparound porch, I should say, not a patio. And it was wine time, and we're all sitting there. Sorry, I know it's coffee time for Margot and you,
Oh,
but it was wine
my
time
husband
then.
brought me some. Look that.
Oh, good, yay! So, we were sitting there, and the fireflies were coming up. It was like the end of July, beginning of August, and these fireflies were coming up, and we saw these dark shadows kind of descend down and come up. And like you say in your book, there was no sound. So we're like, what is this? And they turned out to be barred owls. And every evening, none of us we didn't want to leave the B&B, because like there were a barred owl family, husband and wife. I'm just saying husband and wife, I don't know. And they had their little young owlets that they were teaching to hunt after the fireflies, but they were quiet. And so this became like, who cares about TV when you've got owls in the front yard? Is that how it's like at your house? Like, and I want people to kind of understand, like, that our backyards can be these habitats and we can coexist. And I think your book really proves that coexistence like that.
Yeah, I think coexistence is really the key word. And as far as you can't hear them flying, yeah, Alfie flew right between me and a magazine photographer who was here last night. It was about 9 p.m. Had been dark for a couple of hours. We were waiting for her to show up, and we were both standing on the deck because we could hear her singing, and then we saw her, and she flew right between us, and you could not hear any sound. If you had your eyes closed, you would have no idea that an owl just flew 1 foot away from you.
Amazing. Amazing. Owls they're interesting, because I also think you touch on this in the book too, that there's this, like, they're creepy, and especially it's October, right? So we look at the owl's eyes, and everybody has, it's kind of like they almost get the connotation of bats, and bats are so crucial to our environment. And I think owls are too. And I remember when, Nancy and I travel the country full time, going to parks and documenting public lands. But before that, we lived in Tucson, and, we'd get up at 4 a.m. to walk and you'd see sometimes the moon and then the sunrise, because it gets hot there. But in October, you would see the owls in the morning at the moonlight, and if they were hanging out, there would be 2 together every morning that we would see, and they were doing like a dance almost, and you would hear them hoot and everything. But it did seem to happen around moonlight. What's going on with that? With the moon
Well,
and owls?
I mean, as far as moonlight, I think they actually just see better if there's some light, even though they can see relatively well in the darkness. The darker it gets, the less well they can see. So we can see them better if there's moonlight, and I think they are more active for more of the night if there is a moon out. Yeah, so there's that. And in other cultures, they project human fears and hopes onto owls more than onto other birds, mainly because owls have this very appealing looking face. It's more of a human-like face than a finch, let's say. They are active in the dark, which for almost all of human history and current human psychology is a scarier time. Time when people really couldn't really go anywhere for the most part. And so some cultures see them as very bad omens. In Europe, they were associated with the devil. I mean, in Europe, everybody was obsessed with Satan, in Christianity. And then in other cultures, they are revered or worshipped, or they're believed to be bringers of good luck and good news. So if you see an owl, something good is going to happen. And in an adjacent culture, they see an owl and they think that it means somebody in their household is going to die. So what does that have to say about owls? Nothing at all. It has to say about what humans are afraid of or what humans hope for, and then we project, and we do a lot of that in the world. But what we really need to do is what you said, learn to coexist with these other lives around us that we often totally miss or don't even know they're there.
When you were raising Alfie, obviously, and then Alfie, you were worried about the feathers not coming through, and so that Alfie could fly, and Alfie is at that point you didn't know if Alfie was a girl or a boy, and all of that, the baby stage, and then it's like, do we leave? Do we not? Do we let her out? Do we not? It sounded like it was almost like, do I let my kid go on her first date? Do I let her go out to college? You know what I
Well,
mean?
it was a
It
lot.
felt like really like I don't want to say paranoid, but there was like it was worrisome. Like this felt
I
like
was
this was everything.
I was always worried about her. I never wanted any harm to come to her. And we thought at first that as soon as she could fly, she would just go. We never had her in a cage. But as you alluded to, when her first set of feathers came in, most of her wing feathers did not appear. And so when her mind was ready to leave, she could not fly. And so I made I really didn't have much of a choice, because if we didn't put her in a cage at that point, she just would have died flopping around in the backyard. She'd flop around for about one night, and then a cat would get her, or a hawk would find her in the morning or something like that. So we held her through a molt so that I could see whether the feathers were going to come in, and they did. And then at that point, it was almost winter, and I didn't want to just open the door for an owl that could suddenly fly into a world where there was not going to be much food. Since she had not spent the spring and summer and fall learning how to hunt and take care of herself, just to let her out in the late fall with winter, right on top of us, I thought would probably be fatal. So we waited until late the next spring, and then I started to work with her, letting her in and out a little bit. I used to be a falconer, so I knew a little bit about doing some basic training techniques and training her to chase things and catch things by using a fake mouse on a string. And then I thought, okay, well, either she's just going to be in a cage, which is a total dead end and was never part of the plan and not acceptable, or we just have to rip the Band-Aid off. And freedom is a very risky thing, but that was really the only viable choice. And luckily, everything turned out great. A male came around. She laid eggs. All the eggs hatched. All the young ones survived and fledged. And once that happened, I knew I had a story that I would want to share.
That's awesome. Margot, do you have any questions there? I know it's a heartwarming story. It really is.
It is. It is. I just think for the listeners, if you could start them out with how you two met and how you came across Alfie, and let them and kind of share what you felt at the time you first came across her.
Yeah.
And I say this because I myself, in my own backyard, rescued a baby squirrel from the pool.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I know I have a girlfriend online who rescued a squirrel. So the beginnings will draw people into your wonderful book. And
Mhm.
so I give you that opportunity.
Yeah. So somebody found a little baby screech owl on their lawn that was almost dead. And screech owls nest in cavities. You know, it's a hole. You have to go down to the nest. They can't fall out of the nest. So how did this little baby screech owl who was dying wind up in the middle of somebody's lawn? Something was raiding the nest, maybe a crow or I don't know what, but something was raiding the nest and dropped this little chick. And the person who found it called a wildlife rehabilitator. And that person called me because, first of all, they didn't know what kind of bird it even was. It was like unrecognizable and and so near to death that it was even more unrecognizable. And they called me and I said, well, that looks like probably a little baby screech owl. And, you know, because I had a lot of experience with rehabilitation, especially from, as I said, when I was young, um, they started working with me and bringing the owl over here. And then we said, well, you know, we'll do a soft release in my backyard. And then the rehabilitator had to go overseas. And the soft release didn't quite happen as planned because of the problem we talked about earlier, that her wing feathers did not grow in properly. So the release was delayed. And that's what happened.
Wow. And with birds, isn't it really scary with birds? Because they've got such a little heart and such little bones when they're babies. Like, isn't it kind of like nerve-wracking with birds, especially compared to some other animals that may be a little bit tougher?
You know, not, I would say not particularly.
Oh, okay.
They're, you know, I mean, it's not, you don't rough them up in any way. So,
Yeah.
you know, how tough or delicate they are doesn't really enter the equation. Birds of prey are easier than songbirds because they can eat a big meal and they don't have to be fed again for a few hours. Whereas songbirds, you know, you're like constantly trying to stuff a mealworm into a baby finch, you know, every 20 minutes or something like that. That gets to be very, very intensive. But a young bird of prey, you can give them a big meal and then you can come back a few hours later and that's fine. So I would say birds of prey are in a lot of ways easier, and also just their behavioral pacing is more like ours. They're not as, you know, constantly jittery as a little songbird, and they're not bouncing all over the place. They're content to sit for a while in a spot, and they kind of respond. Like, I think their time frame and their time scale is a little more like ours. I think less frenetic than a lot of smaller birds.
Do you think that, like, owls, birds of prey, and even songbirds, are they adapting with what the changes are to their habitat that humans, with our human encroach, right? And even climate change. And I mean, there's so many factors and so much change. Do you think they're adapting with it?
Well, to a small extent, yes. I mean, there are a few birds that seem to do well around people, pigeons and house sparrows and starlings, and have learned to kind of exploit some of the situations humans provide. But mostly we're a disaster to them. Since I was in high school, North America has lost about a third of its bird population, about 1 billion fewer birds today than when I got my high school diploma. And that's mostly because they cannot adapt to having no place to live. And we have, mostly destroyed their habitat with somewhat of the expansion of towns and cities, but even more so the expansion of agriculture and all of the poisons and pesticides that agriculture uses. As a result of the latter, we have a tremendous drop in numbers of insects.
Mm.
When you drove across the country when I was a kid, you were constantly stopping to clean your windshield because of all the splattered insects, and that doesn't really happen anymore. In my neighborhood here, if you look at the street lights in the summertime, they used to be a cloud of bugs, and there would be bats zooming around eating the bugs. Sometimes there are no insects in the streetlights, and this is a shocking decline in the life around us. And that affects the birds because almost all birds eat insects, even the birds that are specifically adapted to eat seeds feed their babies insects rather than seeds because insects are much more nutritious.
Can we talk about the role of birds in the web of life? I always want to go to that because people, like I remember when the avian flu happened, people are like, oh, I don't know about birds in my backyard. And here comes that fear and phobia that as humans, we manage to do really well. So can we talk about the importance of birds in the web of life? Because as we lose them, how does that impact human beings? So that we can save them.
Well, I think, I think it makes the world emptier and sadder and lonelier, for one thing. One terrible thing is that most people they're never taught to see all the birds that are around us. They don't know what's here. They don't know what's migrating or when. On Long Island, if you're a good birder in the spring migration, it's quite plausible to try to see 100 species of birds in a day. If you go out and you say, I'm gonna really try to see 100 species today, you have a very good chance of doing that if you know what you're doing and you're a good birder. About 300 species of birds cross Long Island or nest on Long Island during the year. But I guarantee that if I asked most of the people on this block, can you name 10 wild birds? A lot of them couldn't or barely could. I have a friend who's a high school teacher, and he asks the students exactly that question. Can you name 10 kinds of wild birds? And they get to about 3, and then they say chicken, duck, things like they have no idea. Why do they have no idea? Is it because they're stupid? No, it's because nobody's taught them. No, we have forgotten who we are, where we are, and who we are here with on this planet. And that ignorance is what we pass along rather than a love and a knowledge. And as a result of that, we don't take care of them. And as a result of that, things, they decline more and more. So that's kind of the circle that we're in right now. It's not good for us. It's not good for them.
They are the canary. As we lose bird populations, we know that the environment is not healthy. I when we lived in Mexico, this is before the magazine, before we met you over 26 years ago, Margot. We lived in Mexico for my step grandfather was going through all kinds of medical things, and we moved them to a house on this beach, and it was really a very small house, but we had an upstairs and a downstairs, and I lived upstairs, and we were working with a vet. We were rehabilitating all these puppies that we found in a landfill. So we had all these puppies with scabies and everything, and we were cleaning them, and we all had scabies. So anyway, that's a real fun fact for everybody to know about. But we were rehabilitating them. We trained them, we cleaned them up, and we then brought them over the border with vet certificates and got them homes, which was great. But while we were there was an injured kestrel, and it had an injured to his wing, and it was fixable. It wasn't like a complete broken wing. And next thing you know, the kestrel's in the house too. So where does the kestrel go? Because outside was full of wind from the, everything. Well, I lived with a kestrel, And then came the roadkill. And like you said, they only had to eat like slowly compared. Well, next thing you know, the vet came to do the check, Eduardo, and he's like, I found a dead rabbit on the road, so this is for the kestrel. And I'm like, isn't that gross for the no, no. So next thing you know, this kestrel and I were roommates, even with the roadkill. And I know that's terrible and it's not healthy, but like that was the situation. And this kestrel and I became friends. And there was this communication, and he knew sleepy time. And I'm a musician, so I would sing to him nicely, and he would look and sometimes go, no, that really sucks. But we had this communication that I can't, like I think your book really brings that in, where you can write about it, but until you actually start to coexist, the beauty is joyous and tender and fearful, because you don't want anything to happen to your baby. Like they are family. They become this family. And this kestrel and I, and then it was time to release the kestrel. And we got to release the kestrel in the cliffs by La Bufadora. And this kestrel flew up, came, looked at us almost like a thank you, and took off. And I'm still getting teary eyed about it. It's ridiculous. But it was probably one of the most beautiful things, and showed coexistence can happen, like what you have with Alfie and
Yeah.
so many other
Yeah.
animals,
Mhm.
That's pathetic now.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't take much to get me teary-eyed either. So you mentioned avian flu. One of the things that all of these diseases that come from animals, they come, almost all of them come from the domestic animals that we raise in these concentration camps, where it's like a big viral experiment where the viruses can just keep mutating into new forms and spreading. Why do they kill 1 million ducks or 1 million chickens or 1 million turkeys at a time to stop the spread of these things? Because they start in these intense, confined, crowded, and pretty dirty environments where, we grow these birds that people eat. They are not, almost none of them are wild originated diseases. They start on these, bird, I hate to call them farms because they're factories, these bird
Right.
factories.
It is. And then the way they transport them, I can't stand it. We were in
Yeah.
Arkansas
And
and see
then
their
and then
field
they get
hogs.
out, and then wild birds get infected, and then wild birds die by the droves. So that's another really nasty aspect of our relationship with birds, is
Mhm.
how horribly we raise them for our consumption,
Mm.
and the diseases that result from that.
Even for eggs. And I mean, we've lost our heritage turkeys too. There's a few farmers that like Diesel Turkey in California. Margot, I think they do well trying to keep our heritage breeds alive, because we've got down to one type of turkey that we're all
Yes,
eating,
right. Yeah, that's
you
true
know?
for a lot of kinds of animals, that there were all these different breeds at one time, and now it's down to one. Yeah.
Mm. It's sad. What can we do um, across the planet for birds and Alfies? Do you think we need to be more aware of our habitat, even if it's like, an apartment with a balcony? Can't we do things to help our bird friends, which would also help the beneficial insects?
Yeah, everything needs room to live. That's really the crux of it. But I do know some people who live in Brooklyn, and they live in an apartment. They have a tiny little terrace, and they have some native plants that they grow on the terrace. They call that their pollinator garden. And it's available for some of the native insects. And of course, as I mentioned, insects are crucial to birds.
Mm. And writing, about Alfie and you, Alfie and Me, the book, Carl Safina, everybody. Um, do you hope people will kind of take a little bit of a bigger look in their backyard, start listening to the bird calls, start watching the cycles of life?
Well, yeah, that's kind of the whole message, is that there are these parallel lives that are going on around us, and we need to really develop not just the minds, but really the hearts to want coexistence with the rest of life on this planet, because we're mostly taught nothing about that, or we're taught that it doesn't really matter, that they don't really matter, and that we're the only important thing. And I think the very opposite is true, that all living things matter. That's the way the world really is. It's a world full of living things, and these living things made it possible for us to come into existence. And it's not our, it's not really our decision or our place in any moral or ethical way to say what good are they. Well, what good are we, for that matter? That's the wrong question. The right thing is to realize that we are all here together on the only place in the entire universe that we know of where there are living things, and that's the most miraculous thing there is. So that's what we
Take care
need
of what we have.
to
Take care
honor
of what we have
and to
instead of
cherish.
going to the moon and populating that, right?
Yeah, well, yes, I mean,
That's a
yeah.
whole other crazy
Don't don't
topic, but
even don't even get
yeah.
me started on that idea.
But it seems
Um,
to me, that really you bring up education being a key thing here. And I think stories like yours is a huge part of it. And adults need the education, but it seems like in schools, um, I haven't been to school for a long time and I haven't been to school in this country, but it seems like schools that are like in high school and things like that, it's like, oh, go into biology and you're learning about cells and, dissecting frogs and stuff. Maybe we should start at the level of understanding and appreciation. Like there should be a nature appreciation class that happens at a very young age, all the way through high school. That's not just about cells. And yes, it can get into all of that, which is all fun and cool, but I think we go right into the science and the biology without the caring first sometimes.
well, yeah, the thing about, learning about cells is that it's not taught in a relational way. We're not taught what are the relationships of cells to organs, organs to organisms, organisms to each other, living things to the non-living parts of the world and the life support systems. That is ecology. If you know nothing of ecology because no one has ever taught you anything about ecology, it's impossible to understand the most fundamental thing about the world, which is how all of these things relate. That's the key word, relate to one another. I happen to be an ecologist just by personality, but then also very much by training. And I certainly think that, in my little perfect world, you'd have ecology as one of the core subjects, like, let's say math is, or history is, where you get a progression of classes that expand on it. You don't just get arithmetic one time in your 12 years of schooling. You get, a variety of math classes, and you learn arithmetic, you learn algebra, you learn geometry, different aspects
You.
of it. You should learn different aspects of ecology, or you don't understand how the world relates to each other.
Hmm.
And you don't. So what do we know when we get our high school diploma? We don't know where our food comes from, where our water comes from, where our electricity comes from, where our gasoline comes from, where our waste goes, where any of the
Ooh.
material for any of the stuff in our house came from, how it was made, and how we got it. We know nothing of that. What we know when we get handed a high school diploma is how to buy stuff. That's what we're taught. We're taught how to be consumers, and that's what we're even called. We're not called people, we're called consumers.
Right. That's so funny. We've done gardening shows where garden people are on the show and they're like, well, for the consumer. And I'm looking at him going, you're talking about people listening. Like, don't call our audience consumers, but we
Right.
are. But we are. Carl, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for writing Alfie and Me. Margot, it's a beautiful book. Everyone's got to go get it. You can go to carlsafina.org. Congratulations on the release. We want everyone to read it. And I think it needs to go to schools. Don't you, Margot? I think
I
it needs to.
do. Yeah.
I think so. We could send it to some politicians too. Get their
Curriculum.
hearts a little
If
warmer.
they
Just
can
saying.
read. I don't know if they
Yeah.
can read anymore.
I don't know, but see, but that's the thing.
They
I
can
wonder
in
if our
California.
politics
In
are
California.
directly related to not understanding ecology, right?
Right,
So
right.
it really goes to that. Always
Mm.
wonder, look at John Muir having to get Teddy Roosevelt out in nature and see the
Yeah,
stars overnight, we
right.
need more of that in life and for our
Mhm,
kids. Really do. So
mhm.
thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome, and thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Nice to meet you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Big Blend Radio's Nature Connection show. Follow us at bigblendradio.com and keep up with Margot at margotcarrera.etsy.com.